We're up to mitzvah number 153, and today we're going to do 4 mitzvahs. 153, 155, 158, and 470. All these mitzvahs relate to kosher animals. As we know, we are required by the Torah to eat kosher, and that means that there are certain species that are kosher, certain species that are not kosher. And even the kosher animals, we have to process them in the correct fashion, meaning we got to slaughter it and inspect it and so on. But these 4 mitzvahs relate to the identification of the species of animal to make sure it's kosher before we consume it. Meaning, in addition to the mitzvah to eat only kosher animals and to avoid eating non-kosher animals, non-kosher birds, non-kosher fish, non-kosher grasshoppers, there is an additional 4 mitzvahs that relate to the inspection of the kosher signs of animals. So we have mitzvah 153 to inspect an animal before we eat it, to make sure that the animal is kosher. 155, it's mitzvah to inspect a fish that is kosher before you eat it. 158 is to inspect a grasshopper that is kosher before you eat it. And 470 is the mitzvah to inspect a bird that is kosher before you eat it. And we're going to have 4 separate mitzvahs relating to the prohibition against eating these 4 respective types of food if they are not kosher. So mitzvah number 153 is the mitzvah to inspect the kosher signs of a behema and a chaya, which means an animal and an animal, but specifically a domesticated animal and a non-domesticated animal, namely what we would call a wild animal. We are commanded to look and examine and inspect in the signs of a kosher animal before we want to eat it. You want to eat an animal? Check. Does it have the split hooves? Does it chew its cud? And this is based upon the verse in Leviticus that we have to look at the animals and see this is the animal that's kosher. It has split hooves and it chews its cud. Now, the reason for this is obvious. It's so important for us to eat kosher, to make sure that our diet is in line with the diet outlined by the Almighty in the Torah. And therefore it makes sense. There's a logical rationale that we can understand to not only rely on some sort of hearsay or to make a cursory inspection. No, to go through the signs and to make sure that it is in fact kosher. Now there's a very interesting part of the explanation in the Sefer Chinuch, which is the book that we are using to go through the 613 mitzvahs. He confesses in mitzvah number 153 and 55 and 58 and 470 that really it doesn't make sense to him that this would be classified as its own mitzvah. After all, if you have a mitzvah that it's prohibited to eat a non-kosher animal, well then implied is you have to inspect and make sure that the animal that you're eating is in fact kosher. So it seems extra, it's redundant to have a standalone mitzvah to inspect an animal as a kosher and a second mitzvah to not eat a non-kosher animal. It seems like that could be bunched into one. And what he says is, the way he explains his rationale, he says, I undertook this project to organize all the 613 mitzvahs in the order in which they appear in the Torah, and I followed the system of the Rambam. And I did not withhold my pen to write this down, even though I kind of disagree with it. And he cites the Ramban. So not to get confused, we have Rambam with an M at the end, Ramban with an N at the end. Maimonides and Nachmanides. The Sefer Chinuch is following the system of Maimonides, of Rambam. And he's saying, I'm going to go with his system, even though the Ramban has a different system. And the Ramban omits these 4 mitzvahs in his count of the 613, and he replaces them with other mitzvahs. In fact, there are a total of 17 mitzvahs that the Rambam includes, that the Ramban does not include and instead supplants others instead. Even though it makes sense to me, and my heart grasps the opinion of the Ramban, that it doesn't make sense to enumerate the inspection of animals as mitzvahs, as standalone mitzvahs on their own. Because once you're told that it's prohibited to eat them, then it's implied already that you must inspect it. Nevertheless, I'm going to follow the system of the Rambam, and I'm going to count it, and this is the system that I adopted, and this is what I'm going to follow. And he has that little piece, which is very interesting, where he's saying, just yielding, I'm accepting the organization and the count and the enumeration and the delineation of the Rambam, even though the other system makes more sense. I'm just following the Rambam in the list of 613, even when I kind of hear the other side, and that seems to be more logical. Now, of course, we know that there are two signs of a kosher animal, whether it is domesticated or not. It must have split hooves. It must rechew its cud, the Torah tells us. But there's also two types of animals. There are two names in Hebrew for an animal, one for a domesticated animal, that's called a behema, and one for a non-domesticated, a wild animal, that's called a chaya. And it's important to know not just if an animal is kosher or not, it's important to know, is it a behema or a chaya? Is it a domesticated animal or a wild animal? Why? Because if it is a wild animal, there is the mitzvah of kisui hadam, of covering up the blood. You have to, so to speak, bury the blood of a wild animal, but not of a domesticated animal. That's one practical difference between a behema and a chaya. In addition, the chalev, which is the forbidden fats, are prohibited only in a behema, but not in a chaya. So if the animal is a chaya, namely a wild animal, the chalev is permitted, and if the animal is a behema, a domesticated animal, then the chalev, which is the forbidden fats, is prohibited. So we have signs to determine if it's kosher or it's not. Split hooves, chewing its cud. How do we know if it's classified as a behema, as a domesticated animal, or as a chaya, as a non-domesticated animal, to know whether or not the forbidden fats are forbidden, in fact, or they're permitted, and whether or not we have to cover the blood, we have to, so to speak, bury the blood. This is not found in the Torah, says the Sefer HaChanach. The Torah doesn't say. But we have a tradition. We have a tradition. This is going to be a theme in these mitzvos. We have lots of traditions that we follow. And it's unique, I think, amongst mitzvos in that there's a heavy emphasis on tradition and what's known as our Mesorah, what was transmitted to us from previous generations. We find more of that in these series of mitzvos than in others. And he tells us the horns of a wild animal are layered and grooved and rounded. Now, what does that mean? So he explains. They're layered like the horns of an ox, and they're grooved like the horns of a goat. And he explains that the grooves, they merge into one another, and they're rounded like the horns of a deer. And therefore, he tells us, any animal that does not have these signs on its horns, we assume it's a domesticated animal, not a wild animal. And thus, it will be prohibited to eat from the chalev, from the forbidden fats, and it would not be required to have the blood covered. Well, what if you have an animal that does not have its horns on it? The horns are missing. You know it's kosher because it has split hooves. It chews its cud. You know for sure it's kosher, but you do not know whether or not it is a behema or a chaya, a domesticated or a non-domesticated animal. In that case, well, you have no signs to inspect, but you could recognize what species it is, and therefore You know if it's a wild animal or if it's a domesticated animal, and you are allowed to rely on your recognition. You say, this is an animal that I'm familiar with. This is a bovine. This is a sheep. This is a wild goat. This is a deer, and so on. And you don't need to look at the horns if you do not have any horns. Very interesting mitzvah, the inspection of the signs, of the kosher signs of animals, both domesticated and wild. Mitzvah number 155, it's the same thing with respect to fish. The Torah tells us that there are two signs of a kosher fish. Snapir v'kaskeses, which means it has fins and scales. Fins are like these paddles that it uses to swim, and scales are these scales on its skin. On its skin, it's got these little scales. Now, I don't eat fish, so it's not so pertinent to me, this mitzvah, but nevertheless, it's part of the Torah, and we study it, of course, and this is a very short comment that the Sefer Chinuch offers, and he gives, as he always does, a sampling of laws. And he says, well, how many scales do you need to have? There's many species of fish. Does it need to be completely covered in scales? A handful, is that enough? So he tells us that one scale is sufficient, provided that that scale is under the gill or the tail or the fins. But if it's elsewhere, then we could maybe be concerned that maybe just it's some other fish's scales that somehow got attached or glued on. It would need, if the lone scale is elsewhere, it would need to have two scales. One would not be sufficient. You have a fish, you want to eat it, you must inspect it. Do you see the fins? Do you see the scales? Do you see at least one scale if it's in these specific locations, or two scales elsewhere? It's a kosher fish. Bon appetit. Enjoy. Mitzvah number 158 is to inspect grasshoppers. Sounds delicious. They're very crunchy, I've been told. Lots and lots of protein packed into them. There are certain grasshoppers that are kosher and certain grasshoppers that are not kosher. And again, we're given a tradition that there are 8 types of kosher grasshoppers. And the Talmud lists the names. The problem is we don't know what the actual name that we have today for these species may be. And therefore, already in ancient times, there was a lot of uncertainty which grasshoppers exactly qualify to be kosher and which are not. And that's why today, because not most, but Ashkenazi Jewry does not have a continuous tradition, therefore Ashkenazi Jewry says, we don't have a tradition, we're not going to eat it. However, some Yemenite, especially Jews, they still have a continuous, ongoing, uninterrupted tradition of which grasshoppers are kosher and which ones are not. And therefore, until today, there are people that still eat this, because after all, it is kosher. Now, interestingly, one of the laws that he tells us, when he gives us the sampling of laws, is that if you have someone who is an expert, that expert is reliable not just for themselves, but even for others. So if there's someone who is a bona fide expert and they say, oh, this is a kosher grasshopper, get some yourself, use it to coat your breading for your schnitzel, well, that's great. That would be, in fact, reliable. We still don't eat it. Now, what exactly are the signs? So Sefer Chinuch tells us that there are 3 signs for a kosher grasshopper. It has to have 4 wings that cover the majority of its length and the majority of the circumference of its body, and it has to have 4 legs and 2 additional jumping legs that it uses to jump off the ground. Now, as is true with all these species, we have all sorts of other traditions, and we'll get to more of them in just a bit. There is a custom that Yemenite Jews have that there's like a sign almost written on the stomach of kosher grasshoppers in the shape of the letter Ches, the Hebrew letter Ches, which is the 8th letter of the Hebrew alphabet. And it's the first letter for the Hebrew word for grasshopper, which is a chagav. And this is even cited in some of the halachic literature that one of the ways you can differentiate between a kosher grasshopper and a non-kosher grasshopper is the Almighty kind of put a sign in it. This one's kosher, and I'm going to write it. I'll just tattoo it on its belly so you know exactly, it's easy to find. And even today, most of us don't have much of an appetite for this, but there are some really cool videos online. You can see people pointing out the ches on the stomach of a grasshopper. And finally, mitzvah number 470, to inspect the kosher signs of a bird. Now, interestingly, the Torah does not actually give us signs of a kosher bird. It gives us a list of kosher birds, a list of non-kosher birds, but we don't have a scriptural sign or a list of identification marks for a kosher bird. But the Sefer Chinuch again cites a tradition that if you find a bird that has these 4 qualifications, you know for sure it is a kosher bird. Now, if it does not have these 4, you don't know for sure that it's not kosher. But these 4 would prove that it is in fact kosher. Number 1, it does not claw its prey. Number 2, it has an elongated toe. Number 3, it has a crop. And number 4, its gizzard can be peeled. If a bird has these 4 qualifications, we know for sure it is a kosher bird. Now, it's very interesting that there are many citations in the Talmud and observations in the Talmud and the Midrash and very bold statements regarding the whole idea of classification and identification of kosher and non-kosher animals. And the Talmud itself says that if you just study this subject, you come to the conclusion that the author of the Torah is God, the same creator of all these animals. If you look in the Torah lists the kosher animals and the kosher qualifications in a few places in the Torah, chapter 11 of Leviticus, chapter 14 of Devarim, Deuteronomy, it lists 10 kosher animals. And then it says, these are the animals that you may eat. And then it gives us the rule. Split hooves, choose its cud. So it's saying 2 things here. And when you put them together, you discover something fascinating. These are the animals. It lists the animals by species. And then it says the qualifications. So one of those 2 is redundant, is unnecessary, is superfluous. Just tell me the qualifications and then I could look at every animal and see if it's kosher. Our sages tell us that the verse is telling us something very noteworthy. The Torah, the author of the Torah, is declaring there are 2 criteria for a kosher animal, and there are 10 animals that fit the bill. 10 and no more. Which is something that only the creator of the Torah and the creator of the animals would know. If the writer of the Torah, if the author of the Torah did not have complete knowledge of all the animals in the world, how can the author of the Torah say definitively these 10 and no more? It's a pretty remarkable statement. Moreover, then the Torah lists the exceptions. It gives us the 4 animals that have one sign but not the other. And again, it has that same extra words. If an animal has split hooves but does not chew its cud, or vice versa, chews its cud but does not have split hooves, it's not kosher. And then it lists the animals that fit that criteria. These 4, and these 4 alone, are animals of all the millions of species, billions, trillions of species in the world. These are the only ones that have partial signs of kosherness and not one, not the other. And again, the Talmud tells us, this is the book of Chulin, page 59a, only the master of the world, he could say that there's a single animal that chews its cud and is not kosher, and that's the camel. And the pig and 2 others are the only ones that has the split hooves, but does not chew its cud. And the Midrash cites Rabbi Akiva. Was Moshe a zoologist? Was he a hunter, a trapper? How did he know this thing? How did he know? If Moshe was the author, again, we know that Moshe is not the author, but if you're just an outsider and you're evaluating the identity of the author of this book, and you want to say as a human, what human can make this statement? Even today, every day they're discovering new species that they didn't know existed previously. Rabbi Akiva says, this is proof. Was Moshe a hunter, a trapper? I remember reading that there's hundreds of thousands of species that are native to Madagascar that are not found anywhere else in the world. And we have yet to find an animal that violates these rules. 10 kosher animals, 10 alone have these 2, no others. 4 animals that have one, not the other. These ones, only these, no one else. The master of the world knows exactly the identity of every animal, and he writes in the Torah, he writes this, which is absolutely fascinating. Now, to make matters more interesting, if this is the area in which the written Torah is proven, this is also the area where the oral Torah is proven. The Talmud says that our sages are going to speak about this. They'll give us some more signs. Kosher animals lack upper incisors as long as they're not a young camel. Now, what's upper incisors? In your teeth. You got molars in the back, and then you have incisors that make holes in the food, right? The front teeth. The teeth that show when you smile. Kosher animals, says the Talmud, no kosher animals no kosher animals have upper incisors. So if you find an animal that does not have upper incisors, you know it's kosher, unless it's a young camel. So our sages are saying, we'll give you proof that what the sages are saying is also divine. They'll make that bold statement. In addition, Talmud tells us, we'll give you another sign. If you want to look at the flesh at the edge of the tailbone and look at the direction of the flesh, if it is warp and weft, which means that it goes partially stretches vertically, partially stretches horizontally, Well, that's a sign of a kosher animal. So long as it's not a young donkey. And the Talmud explains that this is our tradition. It's a tradition. Where does this tradition come from? Well, from the previous sages, from previous generations, all the way back to Moshe. Where did Moshe get it from? He got it from the Almighty. So now he's saying, I'm going to give you tools here to prove that this is all legit. We'll put some in the oral Torah, some in the written Torah. Everyone knows, and the evidence is out there. No one else can make that statement. And there's more. Our sages tell us, any fish that has scales definitely has fins. But the reverse is not true. So if it has scales, it has fins, but not all fish that have fins have scales. Again, where do they know this from? How do they say this with such confidence? It's a tradition. Tradition from who? From Almighty. To Moshe, to the next generation, and so on, to us. Was Moshe a zoologist? Was he a marine biologist? How did he know? This is an absolutely amazing set of proofs to the divinity of the Torah, both the written Torah, the oral Torah, and of course to the existence of God. And I also find it noteworthy, perhaps, that in this mitzvah, the Sefer Chinuch says, I'm just going to follow what the Rambam says. It's almost like this is the mitzvah where we say tradition is going to reign. It's going to be something that we just accept. Maybe there's something to that in this particular mitzvah, the Sefer Chinuch says, listen, I don't understand it necessarily, but this comes from the Rambam. It comes from the tradition. I'm going to stick with it. I want to end off with one cool story that's verified and documented and contemporary. There was a great sage. He was recognized as the greatest sage in the world. He passed away a couple of years ago. His name was Rabbi Chaim Kanievsky. And he was an expert in every single corner of the Torah. Literally knew it all like by heart. Every year would finish Babylonian Talmud and Jerusalem Talmud, of course, the whole Torah, every Midrash, every Zohar, every Shulchan Aruch, everything, every year. And he knew it. And when there was a leap year, an extra month, his cycle was to finish the whole Torah in 12 months. If there's a 13th month, then you would write a book in a month. So he wrote many, many, many books. And he particularly focused on very obscure subjects. Obscure subjects that no one writes about. So he wrote one book on, he probably wrote hundreds of books, but one of them was on grasshoppers. So all sorts of grasshopper related stories with him. And one story is that he was once studying a part of the Torah that was related to grasshoppers. But he needed to see a particular species of grasshopper. So I think the different versions of the story, it's actually he told his daughter to go find one or to go to the library to find a book on it, something like that. There's different versions of what exactly he did. She tried to find a picture of this particular grasshopper, couldn't find it. Anyhow, the great rabbi is studying, and from the window, a grasshopper jumps onto his book. The exact species that the great rabbi is trying to look to see a picture of, to see what it looks like, it pops up on his book of Talmud. And he examines it. And I think it had something to do with the hind legs. Torah says that it has 4 legs, but also has 2 extra jumping legs. And the story continues. After the inspection was over, the grasshopper fled away. Left, okay. And, but then the great rabbi needed to see it again. So he needs it again. A second grasshopper pops up and lands, on his lap, so to speak. And then the story goes even further that this story, this is incredible, right? This is like someone who lived in someone who I got a blessing from, and I went to pray with him. I saw him. This is someone who existed in contemporary times. So the story continues is that there was someone speaking. He was saying, listen, people are too naive. They just believe everything. Every story gets embellished and gets blown out of proportion. People believe like this nonsense story about this grasshopper. We have to be a little bit more grounded, logical, rational. That's what he said. And he went to his house and he found it infested with grasshoppers. And he realized that the Almighty sending him a message. And he tried to get rid of all the grasshoppers, but they just stuck around. So he went back to the great rabbi and said, forgive me. The rabbi says, no, you don't have to ask for forgiveness, but if you do, I forgive you. Goes home, not a single grasshopper is left. Now, the question that may be the meta question is, there's so much here. 10 animals that are kosher. These 10 have these two signs, none others. We have the 4 exceptions, these 4, and no others. And we have the upper incisor teeth missing in kosher animals. And the warp and the weft flesh. And that's brought to us, that's the sages talking. The sages are telling us they're making their determination. And they're staking their position clearly. And then we have the fins and scales. If it has scales, it definitely has fins. And the grasshoppers, it has a letter ches on it, on its belly. Why specifically in this area of Torah or of life do we have the divinity of the Torah proven? Like again, Rabbi Akiva himself says, was Moshe a zoologist? Was he a zookeeper? Did he visit the whole world to find out every single species, to inspect every one of the millions and millions and millions and billions and trillions of them? How could it be? Talmud itself says, this is the master of the world, determining and saying clearly, this is my handiwork. The Torah is my handiwork. The world's my handiwork. Why specifically here did the Almighty give proof to the divinity of the Torah and also give the sages the tradition that proves the divinity of the tradition? That's the meta question that we have to perhaps ponder. But we have a fascinating set of mitzvahs. The Ramban says these should not be standalone mitzvahs on their own. Once you have a mitzvah that says you must eat kosher animals, not eat non-kosher animals, well then, of course, you have to inspect it. So he would subsist with just 4 mitzvahs to not eat a non-kosher animal, a non-kosher fish, a non-kosher grasshopper, a non-kosher bird, and so on. The Rambam has 8 mitzvahs. Those 4 plus the additional 4 to inspect it. And I think the value that we gain is to recognize that in the inspection of these animals, we also learn about the power and the divinity and the irrefutable godliness of the Torah. It's legit. It's from the Almighty. And how privileged are we to have them? Mitzvah 153, 155, 158, 470, the identification of kosher animals. As always, my email address is rabbiwolbe@gmail.com. I cherish your questions, your comments, and your feedback.